So this is the Glock 19 Gen 6. And the Gen 6 platform kind of has the internet divided right now. On one side, the Glock fanboys are calling this the most revolutionary platform that Glock has ever engineered. And on the other side of the coin, the Glock haters are saying that this is nothing more than a Gen 5 with a little bit of a facelift, and that Glock is a little bit too late to the market with these updates to remain competitive with other platforms that are currently available. And that brings me to a question that I asked myself. What if they're both completely wrong, and they're both missing some of the best and worst updates on this out of the box? So I just picked this up a few weeks ago. I just finished putting a few hundred rounds through it, and I wanted to break down all the physical and structural differences between the Gen 6 and the Gen 5. I wanted to go over how you can address some of the shortcomings that come with the Gen 6. I wanted to go over how it ran at the range, if it had any type of break-in period. And the meat and potatoes of this video that I really wanted to get into with you guys is the cross-compatibility matrix. Meaning, if you have a lot of money invested into Gen 5 aftermarket components, are they gonna work with the new Gen 6? Or do you have to start over from scratch? Now, although Glock did make a lot of changes to the Gen 6, I think we should start with what's different in the box. When I first opened the box, I didn't know what to expect because over the years, Glock has kind of become a little bit cheap with what they want to provide you. For example, in the box with this one, you get 3 magazines, which is great. That's something they did start with the Gen 5 platform, was always providing 3 of them. You now only get 2 back straps. In previous years, especially with Gen 4 and 5, we used to get 4 different back straps, and now we only get 2. We'll cover why here in a little bit. And then we come to the other part, the optics plates. And this is gonna bring us to the very first thing that is radically different about the Gen 6 versus the Gen 5. So with Gen 6, they have introduced a different modular optics system. But what makes it so much different than the standard MOS system is this one is a direct to slide optic mounting system, whereas the MOS system was a plate design. Let me show you what I mean up close real quick. First, let's talk about what they used to do and why they had to do it. So number one, in the olden days, Glock had to use a system where you had a plate, and that plate had to be secured with 2 sets of screws. You then had an optic. It would sit on that plate and secure with 2 additional screws. The problem with this was you now had a total of 4 screws that could possibly come loose during the recoil impulse. Now, you might be wondering, all right, cool. Why did Glock do it that way? If you look at this Gen 5 slide right here, and that is called our extractor plunger. And this runs from here all the way back. Because that extractor lived on the right side of the slide right here, if you had a hole for your optics footprint right there, and your screw was a hair too long, it would induce malfunctions. So that's how the old system works, but what about the new Gen 6 system? So if you notice here, when we compare it to the Gen 5, you'll notice that we have 2 sets of holes and they are further to the side. In fact, this hole here sits right over where the extractor plunger is. In order to make this work, they had to redesign the extractor plunger. You'll notice that this area on the Gen 6 looks much different than on the Gen 5. And that's because this is a brand new extractor plunger and it only comes back to here. It doesn't go out the back of the slide. And because there's no extractor plunger underneath the hole, now we can have holes closer to the edge for mounting optics. They decided to come out with these plate inserts. And so whenever you get the Glock Gen 6, on the other side of this is a QR code you scan. It'll take you to a chart that will show you, based on the optic you have, which one of these plates will it fit? Now, something that you will notice right off the bat with this is there is a ton of gap back here, and there's a lot of gap right up there. This could introduce some new problems, but we don't know yet. Now, later when we get to the range testing, this is exactly how I tested this. I tested it with the OEM plate using the Gideon Valor Mini optic. It's an RMSC footprint with an enclosed emitter. But what I really wanted to do was have a better plate that not only had recoil lugs on it, but had some kind of support in the front of the optic as well as behind the optic. And so I got in touch with my buddies over at Calculated Kinetics. This plate, it's called a dog tag. It adds this little bit of protection to the front of the optic itself. So that will prevent carbon from flying up and getting on your lens. But it also adds a lot of rigidity and support for this optic so you don't shear off the recoil lugs or the screws that hold it in place. Now, the thing I like about Calculated Kinetics, they always include really good screws that have been heat treated. They also include the right bit size. They also include thread locker, and they include detailed instructions with the torque specs so that you can install it correctly. Now, I did want to make something very clear about this video. In case you guys are unaware, I am having to change the way that this channel runs here on out. Now, I know a lot of you guys that have been watching this channel for any length of time are accustomed to me providing a blog post that has a build sheet and codes for the gear that I test in my videos. Okay, time to smile. However, because we want to remain in compliance with the 2026 safety standards of this platform, we will no longer be providing any links for build sheets, nor will we be providing any types of codes in the descriptions on this platform. Just understand, moving forward, we're gonna have to change some of the terminology that we use, and we're gonna have to move everything off the grid. You can access my entire gear specification sheet in two separate ways. First way is you can download my complete uncensored specification sheet for completely free. All you got to do is go through the checkout. It costs $0. There's no credit cards required, and you can download a vault key to unlock my spec sheet database. The second way that we can do this is I have moved all of my data sheets over to Fourth Wall. And Fourth Wall is a membership site. We've already got quite a few hundred people over there, and big shout out to you guys. I've been hanging out and chatting with you guys in there. Over there, we have 3 different tiers. In the second and third tier, I will always negotiate a special partner incentive with the people that support these channels. And because Gideon and Calculated Kinetics helped us out with today's video, there are some special things over there for you. I'll have the links to both of those down in the description below. I'll have them pinned in the comments. And for you television viewers, here's a QR to my Fourth Wall page. All right, so now that we've gone through the optics system, we need to go over the other changes that Glock has done to the Gen 6 platform. One of the biggest things that you will notice is the grip. But what's interesting is there's a lot more to the differences in the Gen 6 grip than meet the eye. So when you look at this grip up close, you will notice that it's no longer square and blocky like previous generations. It actually has palm swells built into the side. You can even see small little ripples right there where your thumb lands on either side of the grip. You'll also notice that the texture is absolutely amazing. This is what Glock is calling their RTF 6 texture. As someone who owned the Gen 3 RTF 3 texture, I haven't seen an RTF texture since then, and I'm so glad that they came out with this, because one of the biggest problems with Glock in the past, at least for me, is although they had some decent texturing, this whole frame was pretty much completely bare, and whenever your hand started slipping, it could get a little bit difficult to hang on to it without a ton of grip tape or having it professionally stippled. Aside from the contours and the texturing, the next biggest thing that you notice that's different about the Gen 6 is the thumb ledges or index points on both sides. These have kind of 2 main benefits. One is an index point for your index finger so that when your finger is not on the trigger, you have a reference point of where your hand goes. The second being a place for your thumb to rest to help push down on the frame while the platform is reciprocating. And having that ledge is actually a huge benefit. If you've never tried it, even if it's not Gen 6, I highly recommend that you try something that has a decent ledge on it, because it really does help the platform run a lot flatter and a lot easier. Now, the other thing you'll notice about the frame on here, and this change kind of got a lot of flack on the interwebs from companies that do frame enhancements on Glock frames, and that's going to be the undercut trigger guard. If you've never had a Glock before, if we compare it to the Gen 5, you can see that the trigger guard undercut where your knuckle goes was very thick. And the angle of that bevel on the underside of previous Glocks would give you a callus on your middle knuckle of your middle finger, and we called it Glock knuckle. Well, with this one, not only have they thinned it out, but they've also rounded it out. And I think Glock knuckle is a thing of the past. It feels a lot better, but what I like about it the most is it allows you to get a higher grip on the platform. And when you get a higher grip and a tighter grip, you're able to use it more effectively. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of people were kind of fighting about this was they were saying that it was way too thin. And I saw this coming from companies that do frame enhancements and do undercuts on trigger guards. And what I found so fascinating about it was I would see these companies in the comments saying it's too thin, it's not going to be structurally sound. However, when I looked at the enhancements that they do, they made theirs just as thin. So kind of funny, I thought. The other thing about this frame that you'll probably notice right off the bat is this extended beaver tail. Now, earlier when I showed you what was in the box, I mentioned that in previous years, Glock included 4 back straps, and now they only include 2. And that's because when they used to include 4, they didn't have that extended beaver tail built into the frame. They had 2 sizes of the back strap that had a beaver tail, then they had 2 sizes without the beaver tail. And now they just include the beaver tail built into the frame, so technically you only need 2 back straps. Now, some people hate the way that this looks. They think it doesn't look right. They think it looks funny. Personally, I mean, I think that's a subjective thing. I think it looks pretty good on it, but more importantly than how it looks, I like the functionality of it. Now, when we look at the slide on the exterior of it, it almost looks identical to the Gen 5, but you will notice a couple of other differences. The first thing that caught my attention is the slide serrations. Although they look almost the same, when you actually start looking at them up close, you'll notice that the serrations, at least towards the top of the slide, are much deeper. And as you go from top to bottom, they get a little bit more shallow. And I will say, you can actually feel the difference whenever you want to press check this or use the serrations to rack the slide. Aside from the external differences on the slide and the internals of the slide are a lot different than Gen 5. The first thing that stuck out to me is a new barrel notch at the bottom of the chamber on the barrel. Essentially, this seems to be a place where the barrel gets really close to the head of the trigger bar. Let me show you this up close real quick. So right here on the top, we have the Gen 5 barrel, and on the bottom here, we have the Gen 6 barrel. And what they changed on the barrel is actually very, very subtle. This is the Gen 6, and this is the Gen 5 right here. What they've changed is this little bitty notch that's right here. And as you can see on older barrels, that notch does not exist. And it kind of had me wondering like why they did that, because that seems to be where the head of the trigger goes. And that right there has me wondering, will Gen 5 barrels be compatible with Gen 6 Glocks, which we'll cover in more detail when we get to the cross-compatibility matrix. Now let's get to one of the more critical aspects of the Gen 6, and that's gonna be its trigger mechanism. Now the Gen 6 has 2 major changes to their trigger mechanism. The first that you can see right off the bat is going to be the trigger shoe. In olden days, this trigger shoe was completely curved and it had a little blade in it. Some people would swap these out because that little blade didn't recess all the way. And because it didn't recess all the way, it could cause, blisters and calluses on your fingers. Now with this one, this trigger is much straighter. The trigger safety blade does recess further into the trigger shoe than the Gen 5, but it's not as flush as some of your aftermarket solutions. The second biggest change to the Gen 6 trigger is in the trigger housing itself. If you look at this image of a comparison, you can see the very bottom side of the trigger housing from the Gen 5 and the Gen 6 don't look the same, and therefore these trigger housings are not cross-compatible between the frames. Don't worry, we're getting to the part of the video here soon where we go over everything that's cross-compatible and what's not. Now, one of the biggest complaints that I have seen online, and one that I've actually experienced myself, is inconsistency in the trigger on the Gen 6. And what I mean by that is people are saying that it's heavier than the Gen 5, and some people are saying that it feels a little bit different than the Gen 5. Now, my first experience with a Gen 6, it was not mine, it belonged to a friend of mine. He had the G45 Gen 6. When I first tested that trigger, it was incredibly heavy. Much heavier than any Gen 5 factory trigger that I've ever tested before. I mean, most of my Gen 5 triggers out of the box, out of about 4 or 5 different Gen 5s that I own, have all been between 4.5 and 5 pounds. Sometimes a little bit lower than 4.5 pounds. Although we didn't have the trigger pull gauge with us at the moment, I could tell you that that thing was definitely 6 to 6.5 pounds. And once you get spoiled on Gen 5 triggers, why would you want to go to a heavier trigger? That was until I picked up the 19. This trigger feels exactly the same, aside from the trigger shoe, the way it feels on your finger. It feels identical to all of my Gen 5 triggers. Let me show you with the trigger pull gauge set up into the bench vise. First, I'm gonna show that we have an empty chamber and we have no magazines in this platform right now. We're gonna put it up here onto this vise. So we've got the Gen 6 mounted up in the vise right here. I've got the Lineman digital pull gauge right here. We're gonna do 3 pulls on here, take an average, and then do 3 pulls on the Gen 5, take an average. 3 pounds, 12.7 ounces. Pull number 2, 4 pounds, 0.6 ounces. 3 pounds, 13.1 ounces. If we hit the average, we come out with an average weight of 3 pounds and 14.1 ounces. Now this can change depending on how high up or low you're pulling on the trigger. I typically pull at the bottom because that's where my finger naturally lands. So let's move to the Gen 5. All right, we're gonna clear this out. We're still on that 3 pounds, 14 ounces. Cleared that out. Now we're gonna do 3 pulls on the Gen 5. That one pulled pretty low. 3 pounds, 3.4 ounces. Oh, that one pulled kind of high. 5 pounds, 1.4 ounces. And that one pulled at 3 pounds, 7.4 ounces. If we take the average, we're at 3 pounds, 14.7 ounces. Here's the deal, guys. I don't think that these triggers are actually at 3 pounds. I think they're closer to actually 4 to 4.5 pounds. The things you need to understand about these gauges: sometimes this can go up or down depending on how fast or slow that you pull on the gauge, and it can also depend on where you're pulling on the trigger shoe itself. What I want you to really pay attention to is the comparison between the Gen 6 and the Gen 5. That's what we're looking for, is consistency. Because I could take my analog gauge right here from Wheeler, and this Wheeler gauge tends to be my most accurate, but I have to hold it because it tends to move like that. But if we did like a quick test on it, let's see, if I hold it in place and we look at this, it shows 5 pounds on the nose, and it shows the same thing on the Gen 6. Now let's take a look at the take up, break, and reset on the Gen 6. We have an empty chamber and we have no magazines in this platform right now. If you guys wondering why I'm doing it this way, this is all part of this platform's 2026 safety standards. So when you grab right here, you got a little take up. It's just as spongy as it was in the Gen 5s, at least for me. You get a wall, you get a break. Now we have a reset, wall, I can't speak for everyone's trigger, but I can say, at least for the one that I have, it feels just like a Gen 5 trigger. I have zero complaints about it. However, there is good news if you don't like the trigger of this. And that's gonna bring us to the next part. Which parts between Gen 5 and Gen 6 have cross-compatibility, whether they be OEM or aftermarket? I only wanted to focus on 2 or 3 specific parts that a lot of people are worried about having cross-compatibility between Gen 5 and Gen 6. Earlier we mentioned that that barrel on the Gen 6 has a notch cut out on it, and a lot of people have stated that the Gen 5 barrels will not work on the Gen 6 platform. They do work just fine. I've swapped the barrels out on this and had zero issues with it locking open. Now I haven't taken it to the range to test that, but testing it with snap caps and cycling it, it seems to have no issues and it feels no different. Now when the Gen 6s first came out, Radian, the guys that make the ramjet afterburner, they made a post saying, hey, all of our Gen 5 ramjets will be compatible with Gen 6. Once they learned about that little notch cutout, they since have retracted that statement and said that you shouldn't run Gen 5 and that they're coming out with Gen 6. I know the guys at Radian, they're very nice people and they care a lot about their customers. I don't know if someone from Glock told them that they shouldn't run Gen 5 barrels or not, but from what I've been able to tell, looking in Facebook groups, looking on Reddit, and my own little test here in the office, I can't see the Gen 5 barrels not working correctly. I wasn't really too worried about the barrel, but the slide compatibility I was kind of worried about because of all the news that's been going on with Glock for the past few months with them redesigning the slides to prevent certain things from attaching to them. As you can see, if you look at the back of the slide plates between Gen 5 and Gen 6, you will see that both slide plates are completely different. If you flip the slides over, you can see that the firing pin mechanisms are completely different. They have essentially re-engineered what the bottom of the slide does and what the back of the slide does. And unfortunately, you can't take a Gen 6 slide and use it on a Gen 5. However, you can use a Gen 5 slide on a Gen 6 with certain concessions. Number one, if you look at the Gen 6 and the Gen 5 slide, you'll notice that the Gen 6 now uses the old Generation 3 recoil spring. Because of that, you can't reuse the old Gen 4, Gen 5 dual recoil spring. Now, the downside to this, you can't simply use that Gen 3 guide rod spring on a Gen 5 slide. you need an adapter. And I will have more information about the specifications of those adapters over in my Vault database and on our fourth wall page. But essentially, one has to take that Gen 3 recoil spring, put it into their Gen 5 slide, but then there's one more step. You have to take a Gen 6 backplate to put onto the Gen 5 slide. And if you do those two things to your slide, you should be able to run Gen 5 slides on the Gen 6 frame, no problem. The reason this is important is over the years, the aftermarket has come out with a lot of Generation 5 slides. And because of today, there's no Generation 6 slides. So this is a little bit of a workaround. Now, the next thing that I was worried about, because as we talked about earlier, was the trigger inconsistencies. And as I talked about earlier, the bottom of that trigger housing is completely different and is not cross-compatible. However, the Gen 5 trigger shoes, the Gen 5 trigger bar, the Gen 5 trigger connector, the Gen 5 safety plunger, all of those are compatible. So if you needed something that was a little bit better than OEM, you can still tailor it to your needs as long as you use the Generation 6 trigger housing. Now, another one that I saw was magwells. Now, when I first picked up the Gen 6, I did see that some aftermarket companies were releasing Generation 6 magwells. I was going to order one, however, they had like a 2-month lead time on them. And so I wanted to see if my Generation 5 magwells were compatible with the Gen 6 platform. Because when you look at the bottom of the magwells and put the calipers to them, they basically have the same exact dimensions. Why wouldn't it fit? The only magwell that I have tested as of right now is this guy. This is the Zev Pro magwell. This is the main one that I've been using for Gen 5 over the years. This one fits perfectly. It looks identical in fitment to the way that it fits onto my Gen 5. The biggest thing that you're gonna notice is it looks a little bit funny because of the way they've done the texturing on here, whereas on the Gen 5, because the texturing isn't so aggressive, you don't see that hard line at the bottom of the grip. So that might bother some people, but fortunately, it fits no problem. I know I've thrown a lot at you right now. We've talked about what's different. We didn't go over every little thing, but the main things that are different between Gen 6 and Gen 5. We've talked about the compatibility between the different generations of different components and such. But how the heck does this thing feel to actually run at the range? At my range test, I noticed that this had 0 break-in period. Of the few hundred rounds I put through it, I tested this with Generation 5 magazines, the Gen 6 magazines. I mean, they're basically the same, but I call them Gen 6 because that's what was included with it. Tested them with Gen 3, Gen 4 magazines. I tested them with P-mags, all kinds of stuff. Nothing had any issues. And honestly, the thing about Glock is, fortunately, they always tend to run reliably. No malfunctions of any kind. It was just as accurate as I can be, but I did notice one huge difference. And you can't really see the difference, but you can really feel the difference. And that was, because of this grip texture and because of these thumb ledges, this is safe, by the way, I didn't have to actually milk the grip and my hands didn't slip. And because of those thumb ledges, I was able to keep the recoil down a lot more and have a little bit of a faster follow-up than I would with a standard Gen 5 Glock frame. Aside from that, it feels identical. Now, when I was doing my testing, I also racked the slide using the optic with the OEM optic plate. It didn't lose any type of zero, and it didn't move at all, regardless if the plate looked funny with the OEM plates or not. Now, going back to what I talked about earlier in the video, a lot of people, especially the haters, have said that it's nothing but a reskin Gen 5 and they're a little bit too late to market with the updates they have to remain competitive with its main competitors out there. And so I put together this chart right here that compares the average MSRP of different platforms as well as some of the features included. And if you look at this right here, you can see the average MSRP on the far left. You can see how many mags are included with each platform on the next column. And on the third column, you can see how many optics plates, if any, are typically included with said platform. And then you can see if it included optic height sights for co-witnessing, and you can see what my final verdict of it is. The biggest thing that I've kind of taken away from this chart that I'm showing you on the screen is roughly all of them have really close to the same MSRPs. The Glock includes the most magazines right out of the box, and I think the price kind of reflects that. Now, with that said, I do think it is the most feature-rich Glock that has ever been made. But how does it compare to these? But the main thing I want you to look at and notice with this chart is every single platform has pros and cons. They all have trade-offs. You know, with one, you get more optics plates, but you don't get optic height sights. Or with one, you get a better monetary value, but you don't get any plates included with it. And so it's a really tough balance to balance that out, but I really wanted to talk about that because all of these platforms I am in love with. It's just, which one would you choose and which one would fit you and your needs the best. For me personally, my top 3 picks would be right off the bat, the Glock, the M&P, and the Echelon. Those are my top 3, but everybody's a little bit different. Now, if you're curious about how I made these charts, I recently released a Notion dashboard for guys like us. At its core, it's an inventory tracker so that if something ever happened to your home or your tactical assets, insurance isn't gonna cover it unless you have a detailed ledger of everything. And I've created this dashboard so guys like us can track it. But there's also a lot of other things in there. You can track how things perform at the range, cleaning schedules, you have battery change reminders based on the date the battery was installed. And for those guys that are kind of like me and don't really want their stuff on the internet, it also includes an Excel spreadsheet that can be encrypted and passworded, as well as a printable PDF. Now, similar to the fourth wall page and similar to that of the Vault spec sheets, more information about that is included in the links in the description. Going back to what we talked about earlier in the video, when I said that everyone was kind of wrong about the Glock Gen 6. Do I think it's the most revolutionary Glock that's ever come out? Yes, it's the most revolutionary Glock that's ever come out. It's not the most revolutionary handgun in general, but for Glock, this is one of the biggest changes that they've ever made. If you look at Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5, the changes were very subtle over the years. But this has the most drastic amount of changes that we've seen so far. In regards to the Glock haters, do I think they're a little bit late to the market with these features? Absolutely. Other platforms have had these features and more features available for a couple of years now. And if Glock didn't do something to kind of pivot, then they were gonna lose. And so I'm glad they kind of made this pivot because it does make this my favorite Glock that I've ever tested. But am I gonna tell you it's the best platform for you to go get? No, because I think that's something that you can only learn for yourself through knowing what you need and knowing what fits those needs the best. But let me know your questions down in the comments section. And until next time, I love you and you guys stay sexy.